The heavy, reinforced glass doors of the county probate courthouse felt like the entrance to a concrete tomb. The morning air was bitterly cold, carrying a sharp, biting wind that sliced right through the thin fabric of my clothes. But I could not bring myself to walk inside. Not yet. I stood on the massive stone steps, leaning heavily against a cold marble pillar, fighting a wave of intense, blinding dizziness. I had not eaten a single solid meal in exactly 48 hours. My stomach was a tight, painful knot of pure starvation. I was wearing the exact same dark gray slacks and wrinkled white button-down shirt I had worn to the intensive care unit the night my father's heart finally gave out. I reached into the pocket of my slacks. My fingers brushed against a completely useless, deactivated plastic debit card, a dead smartphone, and absolutely nothing else. I possessed exactly $0.00. I did not have the bus fare to get back to the city. I did not even have the loose change required to buy a stale cup of black coffee from the vending machine in the lobby. I was entirely, utterly destitute, and that was exactly the plan. A sleek, immaculate black European town car pulled smoothly up to the courthouse curb, its dark-tinted windows reflecting the bleak morning sky. The heavy rear door opened, and a polished black leather stiletto stepped out onto the concrete. Victoria had arrived. My older sister did not look like a woman who had just buried her father. She looked like a corporate predator arriving at a highly publicized corporate merger. She was wearing a custom-tailored dark navy blue designer suit that easily cost more than a reliable used car. Her dark hair was styled into a flawless, sharp, asymmetrical cut, completely untouched by the aggressive wind. She wore heavy, dark designer sunglasses, completely hiding her eyes, projecting an aura of absolute, no untouchable superiority. She was not alone. Flanking her on either side were three men in immaculate $1,000 charcoal suits. They were the senior partners from the most aggressive, ruthless corporate litigation firm in the state. They carried thick, heavy leather briefcases filled with airtight legal documents and aggressive financial injunctions. Victoria stopped at the bottom of the marble steps. She slowly pushed her dark sunglasses down the bridge of her nose, her eyes scanning the entrance until they locked entirely onto me. She took in the sight of my wrinkled clothes, my exhausted posture, and my completely empty hands. A slow, incredibly vicious, and utterly triumphant smirk spread across her perfectly painted lips. She had won. The physical evidence of my absolute misery was the ultimate trophy she had spent the last 2 days meticulously constructing. Sterling Developments was an $80 million empire built on steel, reinforced concrete, and exhausted labor. My father had built the commercial construction company from the dirt up. For the last 10 years, I had worked directly in the trenches with him. I wore hard hats, managed the brutal supply chain logistics, negotiated with the aggressive steel unions, and breathed the heavy dust of the active construction sites. I knew the name of every single foreman on our payroll. Victoria despised the dirt. She despised the noise. And she only ever appeared at the construction sites when the massive glass towers were finally finished, wearing expensive dresses to cut the ceremonial ribbons and pose for the glossy architectural magazines. She viewed the $80 million company not as a legacy to be managed, but as a massive liquid cash register waiting to be completely drained. And she knew that my father intended to leave the operational control of the empire entirely to me. But my father had made one massive or catastrophic logistical error during his declining health. 5 years ago, during a severe medical scare, he had signed a broad, sweeping financial power of attorney document, naming Victoria as his emergency proxy. He recovered, and the document was completely forgotten, buried in the bottom drawer of his home office, until exactly 48 hours ago. The absolute second the flatline alarm sounded in my father's hospital room, Victoria did not cry. She did not hold his hand. No, she immediately walked out into the sterile white hallway, pulled out her phone, and activated the dormant power of attorney with terrifying premeditated precision. She used the legal proxy to completely seize control of the corporate banking infrastructure. She instantly froze my personal checking and savings accounts. She permanently revoked my corporate credit cards. She even ordered the building management of the luxury high-rise where I lived, a building legally owned by Sterling Developments, to completely disable my electronic key fob, locking me out on the street with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. It was the ultimate barbaric starvation tactic. Victoria knew that to contest a fraudulent will in a probate court regarding an $80 million estate, I would need to hire a team of highly specialized corporate litigators. I would need to pay massive upfront retainer fees. By completely annihilating my financial existence, she had entirely stripped me of my ability to fight back. You cannot hire a $5,000 an hour lawyer when you cannot even afford a single slice of bread. She intended to walk into the courtroom, present an outdated, fraudulent document naming her as the sole heir, and watch the judge sign the entire empire over to her by complete, uncontested default. Victoria slowly walked up the marble steps, her expensive heels clicking rhythmically against the stone. Her 3 corporate lawyers parted seamlessly, allowing her to stop exactly 2 feet in front of me. "You look absolutely dreadful," Victoria noted, her voice dripping with fake, sickening sympathy that masked a deep, venomous cruelty. "You really should have gone home and rested. There is absolutely no reason for you to put yourself through this legal proceeding today. It is going to be incredibly brief." "I do not have a home anymore, Victoria," I replied, my voice raspy from severe dehydration, but completely devoid of the tears she so desperately wanted to see. "You made absolutely sure of that." Victoria let out a soft, elegant laugh, completely devoid of any human warmth. "I am simply protecting the corporate assets of Sterling Developments," Victoria said smoothly, adjusting the cuff of her expensive navy blue suit. "Father was clearly not in his right mind during his final years. He was letting you play at being an executive. I am simply restoring the natural legal order of the company. I already have 3 private equity firms completely lined up to purchase the heavy machinery division the absolute second the judge stamps my paperwork. She was going to sell the company for parts. She was going to fire hundreds of loyal construction workers who had spent decades building the empire, or simply to secure a massive, immediate cash payout to fund her high society lifestyle. The judge is going to ask for the forensic accounting ledgers," I warned her, fighting the heavy dizziness clouding my vision. "You cannot just freeze a corporate executive out of the banking infrastructure without triggering a massive federal audit." Victoria stepped closer, invading my personal space. The smell of her expensive, heavy perfume was entirely suffocating. "There will be absolutely no audit," Victoria whispered, a dark, victorious glint in her eyes, "because you are walking into that courtroom completely unrepresented. You have no legal counsel. You have no forensic evidence. You have absolutely nothing but a wrinkled shirt and an empty stomach. The judge will ask if there are any formal, legally filed objections to the will I am presenting. You will have to stand there in complete silence, and because you cannot afford the paper required to file an objection." She smiled again, a cold, shark-like expression. "Watch me take everything," Victoria promised softly. She turned on her heel and walked elegantly through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse, her 3 expensive lawyers following obediently behind her like heavily armed mercenaries. I stood alone in the freezing wind for exactly 1 more minute. I closed my eyes, took a slow, deep breath to steady my violently shaking hands, and pushed through the heavy glass doors. The interior of the courthouse was massive, built of cold white marble and dark polished walnut. I passed through the metal detectors and walked slowly down the long, echoing corridor toward probate courtroom number 4. When I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, the sheer, absolute imbalance of power was immediately, visually terrifying. On the right side of the center aisle, the petitioner's table was completely dominated by Victoria's legal team. They had spread out massive, thick leather binders, glossy financial charts, and pristine legal briefs. Victoria sat at the absolute center of the table, her posture perfectly straight, projecting the undeniable confidence of a wealthy queen sitting on a conquered throne. On the left side of the aisle, the respondent's table was completely, devastatingly empty. There were no binders. There were no lawyers. There was just a single bare wooden chair. I walked down the aisle, the heavy silence of the massive room pressing down on my shoulders. I pulled the bare wooden chair out and sat down. The polished wood of the table felt incredibly cold against my hands. I stared straight ahead, completely ignoring the soft, mocking chuckles coming from Victoria's legal team. The heavy, booming voice of the courtroom bailiff suddenly shattered the quiet murmuring. "All rise. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Arthur Pendleton presiding." The heavy wooden door behind the elevated bench swung open. Judge Pendleton, a stern, gray-haired man known for his absolute, uncompromising adherence to strict legal procedure, took his seat. He adjusted his reading glasses, opened the thick case file resting in front of him, and looked down at the violently unbalanced courtroom. He looked at Victoria's massive, expensive legal team. Then he looked directly at me, sitting completely alone, starving and entirely penniless. "We are here today for the final probate hearing regarding the estate of the late Marcus Sterling," Judge Pendleton announced, his voice echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. "I have a petition for the immediate execution of the last will and testament, filed by the primary beneficiary, Victoria Sterling." The judge looked over the rim of his glasses, his expression completely unreadable. "Is the executor of the estate present?" the judge asked. "Is the executor of the estate present?" Judge Pendleton asked again, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence of the massive marble courtroom. At the petitioner's table, the lead attorney for my sister slowly stood up. His name was Richard Harrison, a senior partner who billed at exactly $2,000 an hour. He smoothed the front of his pristine, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit, completely radiating the aggressive, unshakable confidence of a man who was about to win an $80 million corporate empire by absolute default. "Your Honor," Harrison began, his voice smooth, highly practiced, and echoing loudly across the empty wooden benches of the gallery. "The named executor in the document we have submitted to the court is my client, Victoria Sterling. As the deceased's eldest daughter and acting under a broad, legally binding financial power of attorney executed 5 years ago, my client has already assumed emergency administrative control of Sterling Developments." Harrison picked up a thick, completely pristine leather binder from the polished mahogany table and gestured casually toward my entirely empty table on the left side of the aisle. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Harrison continued, his tone dropping into a register of fake, sickening professional sympathy, "we note for the official court record that the respondent, the younger sister, has appeared today entirely unrepresented by legal counsel. She has not filed a single formal objection with the county clerk in the last 48 hours. She has not submitted any competing financial documentation. She is completely unprepared to challenge the validity of the 15-year-old last will and testament my client is presenting today." Victoria did not look at the judge. She slowly turned her head and looked directly across the center aisle at me. She rested her elbow on the polished mahogany table, resting her chin on her perfectly manicured hand, and offered me a slow, incredibly vicious, and utterly triumphant smirk. Her dark designer sunglasses were resting on the table now, completely exposing the cold, predatory greed shining in her eyes. She knew exactly why I had not filed a single formal objection. To file an emergency injunction in a probate court required a mandatory filing fee of exactly $450. Thanks to her aggressive, premeditated financial freeze, I literally did not possess the $450 required to ask the legal system for help. The heavy, painful knot of starvation twisted violently in my stomach, sending a wave of dizzying nausea through my chest. I gripped the edges of the cold wooden table, my knuckles turning entirely white, forcing myself to remain perfectly upright. I stared directly back into Victoria's eyes, refusing to break. They're refusing to give her the absolute satisfaction of seeing me cry. "Is this accurate?" Judge Pendleton asked, looking directly down at me from the elevated mahogany bench, his gray eyebrows knitting together in severe legal concern. "Do you have legal representation? Are you prepared to present any evidence to contest the complete transfer of the $80 million estate to the petitioner?" I opened my mouth to speak, my throat incredibly dry, my voice threatening to crack under the massive, crushing weight of my physical exhaustion. Before a single word could leave my lips, the heavy, reinforced oak doors at the absolute back of the courtroom did not just open. They were pushed completely apart with a heavy, deliberate force that shattered the quiet murmuring of Victoria's legal team. The entire room whipped their heads around in synchronized shock. Standing in the center aisle was Elias Thorne. Elias did not look like the three expensive corporate mercenaries sitting next to Victoria. He was 65 years old, wearing a slightly faded, incredibly ordinary beige suit that looked like it had been purchased a decade ago. His tie was slightly crooked, and he wore thick, wire-rimmed glasses. He was the chief forensic accountant for Sterling Developments. He was a man who spent his entire life surrounded by dusty filing cabinets, complex federal tax ledgers, and the relentless, deafening noise of active construction sites. He was my father's most trusted, absolute confidant. Clutched tightly in his right hand was a heavy, incredibly secure, brushed steel briefcase secured with two massive combination locks. Victoria's triumphant smirk evaporated instantly. The blood completely drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking suddenly pale and incredibly tense. She violently grabbed the sleeve of Harrison's expensive charcoal suit, her perfectly manicured nails digging sharply into the fabric. "What is he doing here?" Victoria hissed, her voice a frantic, breathless whisper that carried loudly across the silent courtroom. "I personally terminated his employment contract at the corporate office exactly 24 hours ago. I revoked his security clearance. He has absolutely no legal standing in this building." Harrison instantly scrambled to his feet, his heavy wooden chair screeching harshly against the polished marble floor. His sleek, confident demeanor was entirely replaced by the aggressive, panicked energy of a lawyer watching a massive anomaly enter his perfectly controlled environment. "Objection, Your Honor," Harrison barked loudly, pointing a completely unprofessional finger directly at the elderly accountant, walking slowly down the center aisle. "I object in the absolute strongest possible terms." Now, Elias Thorne is a disgruntled former employee of Sterling Developments. He was formally, legally terminated by the acting executive, Victoria Sterling, yesterday afternoon. He has no legal right to address this court, and his interruption is a blatant, desperate attempt to derail a verified legal proceeding. Judge Pendleton did not slam his heavy wooden gavel. He did not need to. He simply removed his reading glasses, leaned far over the elevated mahogany bench, and fixed Harrison with a stare so incredibly cold it could have frozen the air in the room. "Counselor," Judge Pendleton said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute, unquestionable silence. "This is a federal probate courtroom, not your private corporate boardroom. If a citizen walks through those heavy oak doors carrying a locked steel briefcase during an active estate hearing, I'm going to afford him the absolute opportunity to state his business." You will sit down immediately, and you will remain completely silent until I instruct you otherwise." Harrison swallowed hard, a visible bead of cold sweat forming at his temple. He slowly lowered his arm and sank back into his heavy leather chair, completely neutralized by the brutal authority of the judge. Elias Thorne reached the low wooden gate separating the gallery from the legal tables. He pushed it open, stepping directly into the center well of the courtroom. And he did not look at Victoria. He did not look at her expensive three-man legal team. He looked directly at me, offering a single incredibly subtle nod of profound reassurance before turning to face the judge. "I apologize sincerely for the dramatic interruption, Judge Pendleton," Elias began, his voice surprisingly deep and carrying the lethal weight of a man holding absolute, unshakable truth. "And while Mr. Harrison is entirely correct that Victoria Sterling attempted to violently terminate my employment exactly 24 hours ago, she lacked the actual legal authority to do so." Elias placed the heavy-brushed steel briefcase directly onto the primary evidence table, located below the judge's bench. He quickly spun the dials of the two massive combination locks. The heavy metal latches popped open with a sharp, echoing crack. "3 weeks ago, DeMarcus Sterling called me into his private hospital room," Elias explained, his hands carefully extracting a thick, heavy stack of documents bound in a dark leather folio. He knew his heart was completely failing, but more importantly, he knew exactly who his eldest daughter was. He knew that the absolute second his heart stopped beating, or she would attempt to use an outdated financial proxy to completely starve her younger sister out of the legal system and seize the entire $80 million empire. Victoria completely lost her composure. She stood up violently, her hands slamming down flat onto the polished mahogany table. "That is an absolute lie!" Victoria shrieked, her high society mask shattering into a million irreparable pieces. "I am the legal proxy. I hold the active power of attorney. I'm simply protecting the corporate accounts from being drained by an incompetent, ungrateful sister. A power of attorney expires at the exact second the principal individual dies, Victoria," Judge Pendleton roared, finally slamming his heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block with a violent, explosive crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Every single financial action you have taken in the last 48 hours is currently bordering on massive civil fraud. Sit down and close your mouth, or I will have the bailiff physically restrain you in a holding cell." Victoria gasped, physically recoiling as if she had been struck. She collapsed back into her heavy wooden chair, her chest heaving violently, her eyes darting frantically between the furious judge and the calm, unassuming accountant standing in the well. "Proceed, Mr. Thorne," Judge Pendleton commanded, turning his intense gaze back to the evidence table. "What exactly did Marcus Sterling give you 3 weeks ago?" "He gave me absolute, irrevocable fiduciary authority, Your Honor," Elias stated cleanly, handing the thick leather folio up to the courtroom bailiff. "Exactly 21 days ago, Marcus Sterling executed a complete, heavily fortified living trust. He formally legally transferred every single corporate asset, all heavy machinery divisions, and all liquid capital entirely out of his personal estate, when effectively bypassing this probate court completely. I am the sole, legally appointed, independent executor of that trust." A shocked, breathless gasp rippled through the empty gallery. Victoria stared blankly at the polished table, her mind violently short-circuiting. If the estate was in a living trust, the outdated will she had brought to court was entirely worthless. The empire was completely out of her immediate reach. "Furthermore," Elias continued, "we're reaching back into the heavy steel briefcase and pulling out a highly secure, encrypted digital hard drive. Marcus Sterling knew that Victoria would attempt to freeze the corporate accounts to initiate a starvation tactic against her sister. So, he intentionally laid a trap." Elias held the dark digital drive up toward the elevated bench. before I can legally execute the transfer of the $80 million empire to the true, named beneficiary, Elias declared, from his voice cutting through the silent room like a surgical blade. The legal stipulations of the trust absolutely demand that I play a sworn, time-stamped video deposition recorded by Marcus Sterling himself. It must be played in an open, federal courtroom, directly in front of both daughters, to establish their final fiduciary standing. Elias looked directly at Victoria, a cold, dark anticipation settling over his aged features. I formally request permission to connect this secure drive to the courtroom's audio-visual system, Your Honor, Elias requested. Judge Pendleton did not hesitate for a single microsecond. He slammed his hand down on the secure button, connecting him to the bailiff's desk. Permission absolutely granted, the judge ordered, his eyes locked onto Victoria's terrified face. Bailiff, drop the primary screens and connect the drive immediately. Let us see exactly what trap Marcus Sterling left for his family. The 4 massive, high-definition flat screens silently descended from the vaulted, cold marble ceiling of the courtroom. The mechanical hum of their internal motors was the absolute only sound in the massive, echoing space. Every single person in the room, the judge, the bailiff, the 3 expensive corporate mercenaries, and my completely terrified older sister, sat in breathless, paralyzed anticipation. Elias Thorne, and the elderly forensic accountant, stood completely still in the center well of the courtroom. He did not look at the screens. He kept his eyes entirely locked on Victoria's pale, panicked face. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He had helped architect the entire destruction of her life. The bailiff plugged the highly secure, encrypted digital hard drive into the primary terminal at his desk. He clicked the heavy black mouse. The 4 massive screens violently flickered to life, bathing the dark walnut panels of the federal courtroom in a stark, cold, blue-white glow. The video feed was incredibly sharp, recorded in flawless, high-resolution color. The background was the unmistakable, rich mahogany and dark leather of my father's private home office. Sitting directly in the center of the frame, occupying the massive leather chair he had ruled his $80 million empire from for 4 decades, was my father, Marcus Sterling. He looked undeniably sick. On his skin was pale, and he was wearing a heavy dark gray cardigan, breathing with a slow, deliberate effort. But his eyes, those sharp, uncompromising, terrifyingly intelligent eyes that had built a massive construction dynasty from absolutely nothing, were burning with a fierce, lethal intensity. He stared directly into the camera lens, projecting an aura of absolute dominance that instantly commanded the silence of the federal courtroom. "Hello, Victoria." My father's deep, gravelly voice boomed through the high-fidelity surround sound speakers, the sound physically vibrating against the polished wooden tables. Victoria physically flinched, her shoulders jumping as if she had just been struck by an invisible hand. She stared up at the massive flat screen, her perfectly painted lips parted in sheer, unadulterated terror. The dark designer sunglasses resting on the table in front of her suddenly looked incredibly foolish, on a pathetic plastic shield against a ghost who had completely outsmarted her. "If Elias is currently playing this encrypted video file for a federal probate judge," my father continued on the screen, a dark, completely humorless smile touching the corners of his mouth, "it means that my heart has finally stopped beating. It also means that my final, absolute prediction about your character was entirely devastatingly accurate." My father took a slow, heavy breath, resting his hands on the top of his mahogany desk. "I built sterling developments with my bare hands," my father stated, his voice dropping into a register of pure, uncompromising steel. "I poured 40 years of my blood, my sweat, and my absolute soul into the concrete and steel of those high-rise towers. For the last 10 years, your younger sister has stood directly beside me in the mud. She managed the supply lines. She fought with the aggressive steel unions. She earned the profound, unwavering respect of every single foreman on our payroll. She is a builder. He leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes narrowing into two incredibly dangerous slits. You, Victoria, are a parasite, my father declared, delivering the brutal, undeniable truth with absolute zero hesitation. For 15 years, you have treated this $80 million empire as nothing more than an unlimited, massive cash register to completely fund your shallow, pathetic, high society lifestyle. You despise the dirt. You despise the workers, and you completely despise your own sister because she actually possesses the honor and the profound work ethic that you entirely lack. At the petitioner's table, Richard Harrison, the $2,000 an hour corporate litigator, shifted extremely uncomfortably in his heavy leather chair. He looked at Victoria, who was now trembling visibly, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging sharply into the polished mahogany wood. I knew that the absolute second the hospital monitors flatlined, you would not shed a single tear. My father's voice echoed brutally through the courtroom. I knew you would instantly attempt to seize complete control of the corporate banking infrastructure. I knew you would attempt to execute the ultimate barbaric starvation tactic. You wanted to freeze your sister out of her own bank accounts, completely sever her corporate credit lines, and lock her out of her own apartment, or leaving her entirely penniless on the street so she could not afford a lawyer to fight you in this exact courtroom. I sat perfectly still in my bare wooden chair on the left side of the aisle. The heavy, painful knot of starvation in my stomach was entirely replaced by a massive, overwhelming surge of cold, dark adrenaline. He had seen it. He had known exactly what she would do. You thought you were incredibly clever, Victoria, my father whispered on the screen, shaking his head slowly. You thought that finding that dormant 5-year-old financial power of attorney in my home office made you the undisputed queen of the empire. You thought you were executing a flawless, predatory corporate maneuver. My father reached down below the frame of the camera. When his hand returned to the desk, he was holding a thick, legally bound financial ledger. But I left that specific document in the bottom drawer on purpose, Victoria, my father revealed. I'm dropping the heavy ledger onto the desk with a loud, resonant thud. I left the active power of attorney as a final, absolute test of your soul. If you had acted with a single ounce of human decency, you would have divided the corporate assets fairly. But you chose greed, and by choosing greed, you blindly walked directly into the Judas trap. Victoria let out a sharp, choked gasp, her hands flying to her throat. What is the Judas trap? Judge Pendleton asked aloud, his voice entirely completely gripped by the massive unfolding financial execution. Exactly 21 days ago, my father explained on the screen, directly answering the judge's spoken thought, I sat down with Elias Thorne. We systematically, quietly restructured the entire corporate banking infrastructure of Sterling Developments. I knew you would aggressively target the primary checking and savings accounts registered under your sister's name to completely drain her financial resources. My father leaned directly into the camera lens, completely obliterating Victoria's entire existence. But I completely removed all of her personal money from those accounts, Victoria, my father stated coldly. Exactly 3 weeks ago, I transferred the corporate operational holding funds directly into the accounts you just froze. Or do you have any idea what those specific accounts currently hold? Victoria was completely paralyzed. She could not speak. She could not breathe. Those accounts do not hold your sister's personal savings, my father roared, his voice shaking the massive surround sound speakers. Those specific, highly regulated financial accounts currently hold the dedicated, federally protected pension funds for exactly 300 union steelworkers. Furthermore, They hold exactly $5 million in restricted, heavily monitored federal government subsidies, granted to our company for a massive low-income housing development project. Richard Harrison's face instantly turned the color of wet ash. The sleek, arrogant corporate lawyer physically recoiled from the table, his mind violently calculating the catastrophic legal radiation completely flooding the room. By aggressively executing that power of attorney, my father concluded, and his voice ringing with the lethal, unshakable weight of absolute federal law. You did not just steal your sister's grocery money, Victoria. You intentionally, maliciously seized, froze, and claimed completely unauthorized ownership of restricted federal union pensions and United States government subsidies. The courtroom was so incredibly silent you could hear the air conditioning vents humming in the vaulted ceiling. That is not a family probate dispute, Victoria, my father whispered, a dark, victorious smile finally breaking across his face. That is massive, undeniable federal wire fraud. That is the blatant, documented misappropriation of union funds. And that is grand larceny against the United States government. My father took one final, slow breath. You wanted to leave your sister with absolutely nothing, my father said softly, offering his final absolute judgment from beyond the grave. But all you have actually done is sign your own massive, undeniable federal confession. I leave you entirely to the mercy of the justice system. The massive flat screens instantly snapped to black. The sudden, absolute silence that slammed into the massive marble courtroom when the 4 high-definition flat screens abruptly snapped to black was completely deafening. It was not the quiet, respectful silence of a formal legal proceeding. It was the heavy, suffocating, radioactive silence of a massive, catastrophic detonation. Victoria Sterling sat completely frozen in her heavy wooden chair at the petitioner's table. Her perfectly manicured hands were hovering entirely motionless above the polished mahogany wood. The stunning, custom-tailored dark navy blue designer suit she was wearing no longer projected the aura of an untouchable corporate queen. It looked exactly like a highly expensive, incredibly suffocating straitjacket. Her jaw was slightly slack, her eyes wide and entirely vacant, and her mind violently attempting to process the absolute devastating magnitude of the federal crimes she had just blindly committed. She had not just stolen my grocery money. She had aggressively, maliciously frozen the federally protected pension funds of exactly 300 heavily unionized, incredibly angry steelworkers. And she had unlawfully seized exactly $5 million in United States government subsidies. To her immediate left, Richard Harrison, the senior corporate litigator who billed at exactly $2,000 an hour, was not frozen. He was moving with a frantic, desperate, incredibly aggressive energy. Harrison was a highly intelligent, incredibly ruthless man who had survived decades in the vicious, cutthroat world of corporate litigation by possessing a flawless instinct for absolute survival. He knew exactly what happened to attorneys who knowingly facilitated massive federal wire fraud, the blatant misappropriation of union funds, and grand larceny against the United States government. They were completely disbarred, entirely bankrupted, and sent directly to a high-security federal penitentiary for decades. Harrison did not lean over to whisper a reassuring legal strategy into Victoria's ear. He did not offer her a single drop of professional comfort. He violently shoved his heavy leather chair backward. The wooden legs screeched harshly against the polished marble floor, sounding like a sudden scream in the dead quiet room. He aggressively unlatched the brass locks of his massive, thick leather briefcase. He began violently sweeping his pristine legal briefs, his glossy financial charts, and his expensive gold pens directly into the bag. The 2 junior partners sitting next to him instantly followed his exact lead, their faces entirely pale, completely terrified by the massive legal radiation flooding the petitioner's table. "Richard," Victoria whispered, on her voice completely broken, her eyes darting frantically toward the scrambling lawyers. "Richard, what are you doing? Tell the judge this is a complete misunderstanding. Tell him my father was entirely insane. Tell him to invalidate the video immediately." Harrison snapped the heavy brass locks of his briefcase shut with a sharp, explosive crack. He did not look at Victoria. He treated her as if she were a highly contagious, completely terminal disease. "Your Honor," Harrison barked loudly, then his voice echoing violently across the vaulted ceiling, completely ignoring his client's hysterical, pleading whisper. He stepped rapidly away from the polished mahogany table, physically and legally distancing himself from the $80 million disaster. In direct light of the shocking, completely unprecedented evidence just presented to this court by Elias Thorne, and specifically regarding the catastrophic revelation of unauthorized federal fund manipulation, committed entirely without my prior knowledge or professional consent, I find myself in a massive, immediately irreconcilable, ethical conflict. Judge Arthur Pendleton sat behind the elevated mahogany bench, his face entirely frozen in a mask of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. He stared down at Harrison, his gray eyes burning with lethal, uncompromising authority. "I must formally, and immediately, petition this federal court for an emergency, absolute withdrawal as the legal counsel of record for Victoria Sterling," Harrison declared loudly, ensuring the court stenographer recorded every single desperate syllable of his defection. "My firm can no longer represent this petitioner in any legal capacity whatsoever." Victoria let out a raw, guttural gasp, her hands flying to her perfectly styled dark hair. "You cannot do this to me!" Victoria shrieked, and her high society mask completely disintegrating into pure, feral panic. She lunged forward, desperately grabbing the sleeve of Harrison's expensive charcoal suit. "I am paying you exactly $2,000 an hour. You work for me. You're going to fix this right now." Harrison violently ripped his arm away from her frantic grasp. He looked at her with an expression of complete, absolute disgust. "You are not paying me a single cent, Victoria," Harrison sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Because the corporate bank accounts you used to pay my firm's massive upfront legal retainers were completely funded by stolen federal union pensions. Every single dollar you gave us is highly illegal, radioactive federal evidence. You are entirely on your own." Harrison turned his back on her completely. He looked directly up at the furious judge. "Petition to withdraw is granted immediately, counselor," Judge Pendleton roared, his deep voice shaking the heavy walnut panels of the courtroom. "Now, you and your associates are officially dismissed from this proceeding. You will leave the well of this courtroom immediately, and you will expect a massive, highly aggressive inquiry from the State Bar Association regarding your firm's preliminary due diligence." Harrison did not say another word. He grabbed the handle of his heavy leather briefcase, pushed open the low wooden gate, and practically sprinted down the center aisle of the gallery. And his two junior partners followed closely behind him, the three highly expensive corporate mercenaries desperately fleeing the building before the federal marshals inevitably locked the heavy oak doors. Victoria Sterling was now entirely, completely alone. She sat at the massive petitioner's table surrounded by empty wooden chairs. She had no expensive lawyers. She had no legal strategy. She had absolutely nothing but the crushing, devastating realization that her own father had completely engineered her absolute destruction from beyond the grave. Elias Thorne, the elderly forensic accountant, stepped forward in the center well. He did not smile. He simply reached into his heavy, brushed steel briefcase and extracted a thick, highly detailed stack of official bank ledgers printed on secure, watermarked financial paper. "Your Honor," Elias stated calmly, his deep voice slicing through the heavy tension in the room, "I hold in my hands the certified, fully authenticated digital routing logs from the Sterling Development's corporate banking infrastructure. They explicitly, undeniably prove that exactly 48 hours ago, Victoria Sterling utilized an expired power of attorney to intentionally freeze, restrict, and claim unauthorized administrative control over exactly $5 million in United States government housing subsidies and the highly regulated pension funds of exactly 300 unionized steelworkers. Elias walked forward and handed the thick stack of watermarked ledgers directly up to the courtroom bailiff, who carried them immediately to the elevated mahogany bench. Judge Pendleton opened the ledgers. He adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the dense columns of numbers, dates, and highly secure federal routing codes. The silence in the massive marble courtroom stretched for exactly 60 agonizing seconds as the judge verified the absolute, mathematically precise execution of the Judas trap. When Judge Pendleton finally looked up, his face was entirely devoid of any human mercy. He did not look at Victoria as a grieving daughter. He looked at her as a massive, arrogant, domestic terrorist who had just actively defrauded the federal government inside his own courtroom. "Da Victoria Sterling," Judge Pendleton thundered, his voice completely dominating the massive, echoing space. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel, holding it firmly in his right hand. "You walked into this federal probate court today completely intending to use the legal system as a weapon to starve your sister into absolute submission and steal an $80 million corporate empire." Victoria was violently trembling now. Tears of pure, unadulterated terror finally spilled over her perfectly painted eyelashes, completely ruining her expensive designer makeup. "No, please, Your Honor," Victoria begged, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. She threw her hands up in the air, her entire body shaking. "I did not know. I swear to God, I had absolutely no idea the federal money was in those specific accounts. My father tricked me. He set me up to fail. It was an honest, complete mistake." Ignorance of the origin of stolen federal funds is absolutely not a recognized legal defense for massive, premeditated grand larceny, Victoria, Judge Pendleton roared, aggressively slamming his heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block with a violent, explosive crack that made Victoria physically shriek in sheer terror. The judge reached out and slammed his hand down completely flat onto the secure emergency button located beneath his elevated mahogany desk. "De bailiff!" Judge Pendleton commanded, pointing a single shaking finger directly at the terrified socialite cowering at the petitioner's table. "Secure the heavy oak doors to this courtroom immediately. Do not let a single person in or out of this gallery." From the dark corners of the massive marble room, 3 heavily armed courtroom deputies immediately stepped forward, their hands resting instinctively on their black tactical utility belts. The heavy, reinforced oak doors at the absolute back of the gallery slammed shut with a loud, echoing, terrifyingly final boom. I sat in my bare wooden chair on the left side of the aisle. The blinding dizziness of starvation was completely gone. I rested my hands quietly in my lap, my posture perfectly straight, watching the exact, absolute moment my cruel older sister realized her life of luxury was entirely, permanently over. "Victoria Sterling," Judge Pendleton declared, formally delivering the absolute killing blow to her entire existence. "I am immediately holding you in direct, criminal contempt of court. Furthermore, based on the irrefutable forensic financial ledgers and the sworn video deposition presented by the independent executor of the living trust." The 3 heavily armed deputies reached the low wooden gate, completely surrounding the petitioner's table. "Doe, I am officially ordering the bailiff to remand you entirely into federal custody, pending formal, massive felony charges for grand larceny, federal wire fraud, and the intentional, premeditated misappropriation of United States government subsidies and union pension funds." The 3 heavily armed courtroom deputies did not walk slowly. They closed the distance to the polished mahogany petitioner's table with terrifying, synchronized tactical precision. Nor their heavy black boots echoed violently against the cold marble floor, completely drowning out the pathetic, high-pitched sobbing coming from the woman who had thought she was an untouchable corporate queen exactly 15 minutes ago. Victoria Sterling, the woman who had aggressively frozen my bank accounts and locked me out of my own home to literally starve me into submission, completely collapsed. Her legs gave out entirely beneath her expensive or custom-tailored dark navy blue designer suit. She hit the floor heavily, her knees slamming against the hard marble. Her perfect, sharp, asymmetrical haircut was completely ruined, falling wildly across her tear-streaked, mascara-stained face. "No, please, do not touch me. I am Victoria Sterling," she shrieked, a raw, guttural scream that tore through the vaulted ceiling of the courtroom. She began thrashing wildly on the floor, kicking her expensive black leather stilettos against the legs of the heavy wooden table. "I did not mean to steal from the government. Tell them, Elias. Tell them my father set me up. I have $80 million. I can pay the union back today." "You do not possess a single cent, Victoria," Judge Arthur Pendleton thundered from the elevated mahogany bench, his voice dripping with absolute, unadulterated, judicial disgust. "The federal government has already placed a massive, or completely unliftable emergency freeze on every single personal and corporate asset registered to your name. Your bank accounts are entirely empty. Your luxury properties are currently being seized by federal marshals. You are completely, utterly destitute." The supreme, poetic irony of the judge's words hung heavily in the freezing courtroom air. Exactly 48 hours ago, Victoria had meticulously engineered my absolute financial ruin. Now, the federal justice system had mirrored her exact cruelty, stripping her of her entire existence in less than 3 minutes. The lead deputy did not ask politely. He reached down, grabbed Victoria by the shoulders of her incredibly expensive designer jacket, and hauled her violently back up to her feet. He aggressively twisted her arms behind her back. The heavy, cold steel handcuffs ratcheted shut around her delicate wrists with a sharp, violent, incredibly final metallic bite. And the sound echoed through the silent gallery like the slamming of a vault door. "Victoria Sterling, you are under arrest," the deputy barked, his voice completely devoid of any human sympathy. He grabbed her firmly by the bicep. "Keep your mouth entirely closed and walk forward." They marched her roughly down the center aisle of the gallery. She did not look like a high society socialite anymore. She looked entirely broken, her expensive clothes wrinkled, her face completely ruined by tears of pure, feral terror. As they passed the left side of the aisle, Victoria violently turned her head, her desperate, panicked eyes locking directly onto mine. I did not stand up. I did not smile. I did not offer her a single drop of pity or a single word of gloating victory. I sat perfectly still in my bare wooden chair, my hands folded quietly in my lap, projecting the absolute, the unshakable calm of a woman who had just survived a 48-hour starvation siege and successfully inherited an $80 million empire. I looked directly into her terrified, weeping eyes and gave her absolutely nothing but a cold, blank, uncompromising stare. The deputies shoved her through the heavy, reinforced oak doors at the back of the courtroom. The doors slammed shut with a deafening boom, and her desperate, the echoing cries faded rapidly down the long marble corridor toward the subterranean federal holding cells. The massive courtroom was suddenly completely quiet again. The radioactive legal storm had passed, leaving nothing behind but the absolute truth. Judge Pendleton let out a long, heavy breath. He slowly removed his reading glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose before turning his attention back to the elderly forensic accountant, standing calmly in the center well. "Mr. Hawthorne," Judge Pendleton said, his tone softening significantly, returning to a register of deep, professional respect. The federal court officially and formally recognizes the irrevocable living trust established by the late Marcus Sterling. The outdated, fraudulent 15-year-old document submitted by the petitioner is hereby stricken entirely from the public record. The corporate holdings, the heavy machinery divisions, and the physical properties of Sterling Developments are officially, permanently released into the absolute executive control of the named trustee. Elias Thorne smiled. It was a small, incredibly proud, deeply warm smile. He bowed his head slightly toward the judge. "Thank you, Your Honor," Elias rasped softly. He turned around, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, and walked directly over to my bare wooden table. He reached into his heavy brushed steel briefcase one final time and extracted a thick, highly secure envelope bearing the official corporate seal of Sterling Developments. He placed it gently on the table right in front of me. "Your father's legacy is officially yours," Elias said quietly, his eyes shining with genuine emotion. "Exactly as he always intended. Are you ready to go back to work?" I looked at the heavy envelope. I placed my hand flat against the crisp paper. The blinding dizziness of my starvation was entirely gone, completely replaced by a massive, soaring sense of absolute resilience. "Yes, Elias," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "I am." 18 months later, the deafening, rhythmic pounding of heavy steel jackhammers and the roar of massive diesel excavators filled the crisp morning air. It was the absolute greatest sound in the entire world. I stood on the fourth-floor concrete slab of a massive, active construction site in the center of the city, wearing a heavily scuffed white hard hat, a bright neon safety vest, and thick steel-toed work boots. I was reviewing a set of highly detailed architectural blueprints with the senior foreman, a man who had worked directly alongside my father for 20 years. We were completely on schedule to finish the massive $5 million low-income housing development project subsidized by the United States government. The union steelworkers did not strike. They did not protest. When they learned that I had personally fought a federal court battle to protect their dedicated pension funds from being completely liquidated by a greedy corporate parasite, I earned their absolute, unbreakable loyalty for life. Sterling Developments was thriving, more profitable and more respected than it had ever been in its entire 40-year history. Victoria never returned to her luxury high-rise penthouse. Her federal criminal trial was a spectacular, highly publicized disaster. Faced with the undeniable forensic banking ledgers, the heavily authenticated digital routing logs, and the sworn, time-stamped video deposition recorded by our own father, no reputable defense attorney in the state would take her case. The federal prosecutors offered her a brutal, entirely uncompromising plea deal. She pled guilty to 3 counts of massive federal wire fraud, grand larceny against the government, and the intentional misappropriation of union funds. She was sentenced to exactly 15 years in a maximum security federal correctional institution, completely without the possibility of early parole. She was entirely bankrupted by the massive financial restitution ordered by the federal judge. Her high society friends abandoned her instantly, treating her name like a toxic, highly contagious disease. Victoria, then a woman who had once arrogantly mocked my wrinkled clothes while actively attempting to starve me to death on the steps of a courthouse, was now spending her days wearing a state-issued, scratchy khaki uniform. She scrubbed stainless steel cafeteria trays and mopped endless concrete hallways for exactly 22 cents an hour. She had tried to use a simple sheet of paper to lock me out of my own life and leave me with absolutely nothing. Instead, she had blindly activated a meticulously engineered federal trap that permanently removed her from my world, leaving me to run an $80 million empire in absolute, triumphant peace. If your greedy sister froze your bank accounts to starve you out of your inheritance, would you have warned her about the federal funds, or would you have let the judge lock her away? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video.